You think you know London? Well, guess again. There are so many incredible gems and hidden histories just waiting to be discovered. In this jam-packed series, we'll take you to every corner of the superb international city that is London, visiting secret local haunts, meeting the people behind them, and unpacking the history of London through their eyes. Hop in and take a ride with us in the London Black Cab and see this fantastic city in the fast lane. Today we're visiting the Museum of London. This vibrant museum tells the story of London and its unique history. This museum has artefacts, exhibitions and galleries covering every period of London's history. A visit to the Museum of London is a fantastic experience. It's a chance to be immersed in life in Roman Londinium, to see the cultural revolution of Shakespeare's London, watch the tragedy of the Great Fire in 1666 develop, and understand the splendour of Edwardian times. From the suffragette struggles for the right to vote to the devastation of the Blitz and excitement during the swinging 60s, the Museum of London brings every period of London's history alive. It was opened by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 1976, and it was the first museum to open in London since the Second World War. It combined two museums, the London Museum and the Guildhall. When the museum opened, it contained 500,000 objects, which has expanded to 1 million in its core collection, plus an additional 6 million finds. From its inception, the museum saw itself as not only about London and of London, but for London. The museum's oldest objects date back thousands of years when you could fit the population of London on a double-decker bus. At the beginning of the Ice Age, the Thames was much longer and ran through a different part of the UK. It started in the Welsh uplands and flowed across the English Midlands and eventually joined the River Rhine in the southern part of what is now the North Sea. Nearly 500,000 years ago, it diverted into its present valley by ice sheets. This simplified temperature graph indicates the major changes in global climate. The warmest and coolest periods appear to be linked to the cycle of glacial and interglacial periods. And this map sequence of the Thames highlights the evolution of the river after its initial southern diversion and into the London basin we know of today. Because of the location of the river, the Thames Valley has been home to communities for 500,000 years before its growth into the London we see today. In the first gallery, called London Before London, we start by exploring the rich lives of the people living in the lower Thames Valley from around 450,000 BC through to the creation of the Roman city of Londinium around AD 50. London's prehistoric landscape was similar to that of today's Central African plains, and on display can be seen a selection of animal remains which have been discovered from all around the capital. It was once home to an abundance of enormous creatures, from rhinos to mammoths and wolves to hippos. It's hard to imagine when you look now that hippos roamed Trafalgar Square around 125,000 years ago. From tools used by our earliest ancestors to symbols of Iron Age tribes, the prehistoric collection showcases the variety and sophistication of life in the Thames area before the city existed. Of the 13,000 items in the prehistoric collection, 11,000 are made of flint or stone. Flint is the longest used technology in the world, and in the London area it was used for around 450,000 years before the discovery of metal. Most of the tools on display in the museum were discovered during building work as London expanded in the 19th and 20th century. As farming spread into the Thames Valley during the Neolithic, Bronze and Iron Ages, so did ceramic technology. The collections at the museum include a range of vessel types, some of which are complete. On display can be seen an impressive collection of Neolithic polished axe heads, many of which are believed to have been delivered up to the River Thames as offerings, along with other Stone Age objects found, including a spectacular collection of mace heads. The museum also has a very extensive Bronze Age collection of around 900 objects, as well as some significant Iron Age finds, mostly recovered during dredging of the Thames in the 19th and 20th centuries. These include bronze fittings from an Iron Age chariot decorated with superb Celtic-style art. London was founded as a settlement known as Londinium, and the museum contains some of the finest collections of Roman artefacts in the country. I spoke to one of the museum's curators about some of the fascinating objects the museum houses.
Life in Roman London would have been quite a challenge to start with. There is no settlement here, there's no town, no city when the Romans first come. They invade Britain in 43 AD, and by about 50 we know that the settlement, the town of Londinium, has been established here on the bank of the Thames. So we're here at the edge of the Roman Empire, an empire that stretches all the way to the eastern Mediterranean and to North Africa. So here in Britain we really are on the northwestern edge. Londinium is founded on the Thames because it's a good crossing point. When the Romans arrived here, there would have been plentiful supplies of timber, of clay for making bricks and tiles and pots, and also fresh water. There are streams that run down into the Thames here, and also natural spring line. So life would have been a challenge initially, but very quickly we know that the population rose. People would have followed the military. The military would have been the first people coming here, soldiers, but very quickly they're followed by traders, craftspeople as well. And by about AD 60, we know that the population is in the region of probably around about 10,000 people. So that's a real boom town as well. So things are going very well for a lot of people. The problem then is that it's attacked by the native Britons, and as far as we understand it, a lot of people are killed. We don't know how many, that's open to lots of controversy. But certainly most of the town is burnt down and has to be rebuilt almost from scratch. But by about the middle of the 2nd century AD, by about the 120s, 130s, we're seeing a population perhaps as high as 30 or 40,000 people. So again, it's growing very quickly. So for a lot of people living here in London, it would have been a very comfortable lifestyle, a very Romanized sort of lifestyle. But when we look at the population, we have to remember it was a very cosmopolitan place. We have native Britons, we have Romans, people from the Roman Empire, and of course that means in today's terms Spanish, Italians, French, German. People from all over the empire would have been here. They would have been trading, intermarrying, talking, chatting, living life here. And it would have been a combination of soldiers, tradespeople, administrators, many probably also retired soldiers who would have got a portion of land and would have been encouraged to settle here in the new town of Londinium. The walls that you see outside of the window from the Roman gallery are not actually Roman themselves. Those walls are later in date, they're medieval, or some of them are even 19th, early 20th century in date. But the important thing is that they are built on the foundations of the Roman wall. And that stretch of wall is really, really important in terms of the history of Roman London. The wall we look out onto is from about AD 120. It's the western wall of the Roman fort. And then about 80 or so years later, around about 200 AD, the administration decides to build a wall all the way around the settlement. And what they do is they use the older fort walls as part of that city wall. So what we look out onto is actually the line now of the old city wall, which continued in use right through to the medieval period. There are an amazing range of artifacts on display here in the Roman Gallery. We have very little evidence for Roman London surviving above ground today. So really, if you want to find out about Roman London, you have to come to the gallery here to see what life was like. We have lots of different kinds of artefacts. Many of them have come from archaeological excavations over about the last 40 years or so. Many of them also have come from antiquarian discoveries. Perhaps the best known group of artefacts, the most famous that we have here, are the collection of sculptures associated with the Temple of Mithras. The Temple of Mithras was discovered in 1954, and we know from the old movie tone news and things that thousands of people visited the site when it was excavated. And what we have on display are some of the marble sculptures that would have decorated that temple. Mithraism was a mysterious cult. It had come from the East, and it flourishes here in Britain, particularly towards the end of the Roman period. We're constantly bringing in new finds as they're discovered through archaeology in the City of London. And what we have on display here are a hoard of about 43 gold coins, which were discovered near Fenchurch Street in the city in 2000. These coins date to the 1st and 2nd century AD, so there's a range of different emperors illustrated on them. And when you look at them, you can see those portraits of the emperors really clearly. And this was really important to think about for Roman Londoners. They are so far away from Rome, they're never going to see their emperor. But when they hold one of the coins in their hand, that reminds them that they're part of the Roman Empire. My favourite artefact, it's perhaps a little bit unusual. It's a pair of leather bikini briefs. Now, we call them bikini briefs, but we don't really know who wore them, aside from definitely a woman. There are 2 pairs on display in the gallery, but we know that we have about 6 pairs from Roman London, and this is unparalleled anywhere else. We don't really know who would have worn them. There's a lot of discussion about whether they might have been worn by young women as acrobats or in gymnasiums, but there's nothing to say that they weren't actually worn by everyday women. They are beautifully made. They would have been quite comfortable, made from goatskin leather, so quite a thin leather. One of the highlights of our galleries, we have room settings which show off the artefacts in the way they would have been used. So just behind me you can see a Roman kitchen, and all of the pots, all of the glass vessels and so on are all original items from our collections. The Bucklersbury mosaic was discovered in 1869. Workmen were building the modern Queen Victoria Street and they uncovered the mosaic. Straight away, people realised what an amazing discovery this was, and the site was opened up to the public for 3 days. We know that in the region of 50,000 people came to visit to see the mosaic. Because it was so important, it was lifted and was put on display in the old Guildhall Museum, subsequently coming here to the Museum of London, where it's always been on display. This mosaic is typical of the kind of mosaic that would have been in a public room of a very well-to-do private house. Here we have set it up to be as if it's in a triclinium, a Roman dining room. And the design itself is made up of geometric designs and also floral motifs. The central motif is a very simplified petal design. We know when it was discovered that an underfloor heating system was found underneath it, and this confirms the fact that this would have been a very well-to-do house. It would have had heating as well as this beautifully decorated floor.
The Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century. And while the Roman way of life disappeared, the square mile of the Roman city walls became the medieval City of London and still remain the commercial centre of London today. London grew as a rich trading centre in medieval England, and the museum has a wealth of artefacts to represent this. Although the basis of London was established by the Romans, there is a gap of 200 years in the historical and archaeological record that reflects a time when London was largely deserted. However, in the 7th century, it began to be established as a large town again. And while invasions, wars and fires threatened London, it gradually developed its structure and importance. The museum's medieval collections illuminate a long period in history, from Anglo-Saxon settlements in the 5th century to Viking raids in the 9th century and the Norman conquest in 1066. The Norman conquest of England saw merchants and seamen from all over Northern Europe come to London, and the city diversified. A variety of languages could be heard as you walked the city's streets and quays. By the 13th century, London was a well-established city north of the Thames, with a population of over 80,000, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. We finish our visit to medieval London covering the period from 410 to 1558, with a look at Tudor London and the reign of Henry VIII. In 1536, when Henry VIII was king and head of the church, under rulings from Westminster, he dissolved the monasteries to lessen the influence of the church and to raise money for the crown and finance his wars abroad. This had a dramatic impact on the landscape of the capital, as the church owned nearly 2/3 of the land in central London, and a multitude of churches and monasteries were disfigured and destroyed because of this policy. It was during the medieval period, from 1087 to 1558, that many famous buildings we know today were planned and constructed. Construction began on the original St Paul's Cathedral in 1087. And the first stone bridge was built across the Thames in 1176. These buildings have undergone changes throughout London's history, from fire to adapting to the changing commercial circumstances, but are still located on their original sites. The 16th and 17th century were times of great wealth, but also extreme poverty and unease. Covering a period which included a civil war between 1642 and 1649 and the Great Plague of 1665, which saw 100,000 people die, this was a period of huge change. During this time, the population increased from approximately 150,000 in 1580 to 500,000 in 1660. And overcrowding, poor sanitation and disease increased, and crime and begging became rampant. The rich and poor inhabitants began to live in separate areas, and the rich started to moving towards the west of the city walls, which at the time was open and spacious countryside. This was also the period theatres began to be established, which clashed with religious doctrines of the time, and saw them initially placed along the other side of the river on the Southwark side, so they would be outside the restriction of the laws within the walls of the city. And then, in 1666, disaster struck again. Previous exhibitions include Cheapside Hoard, Crime Uncovered and Sherlock Holmes. One of the most popular exhibitions was that of the Great Fire of London of 1666. The fantastic display brings the terrifying events to life. Over 350 years ago, the Great Fire began in London and devastated the capital. Thomas Fariner closed his bakery on the 1st of September 1666. He said his oven was out by 10 p.m. that evening. He lived above the bakery with his daughter Hannah, a maid and a manservant. During the early hours of Sunday morning on the 2nd of September, the manservant awoke to find the building full of smoke. Like many houses in London, the bakery in Pudding Lane was probably timber framed and very close to the houses on either side. At the height of the fire, the temperature reached over 1200 degrees Celsius. We know this from the remains of melted items that were later uncovered. These can be seen on display. When the Great Fire started, there was a storm with very strong winds blowing, which culminated in the flames spreading. The parish constables were called and in turn summoned the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Apparently, the mayor was reluctant to order the pulling down of houses without the permission of the owners, as the person pulling them down would have been liable to pay for their rebuilding. Strong winds, combined with timber frame buildings and with no fire brigade to call, meant the fire spread rapidly. There were procedures to deal with fires, but these proved wholly inadequate. The nearby houses were evacuated and the church bells were rung backwards, which reversed the common order of chimes, signalling alarm or danger. There was a plan where all streets and lanes between the fire and any water sources, such as the river, were to be manned by double rows of local people, forming a human chain passing buckets to collect the water. Although there were fire engines available, each engine required several people to operate the equipment and horses to move them. In the very narrow streets amongst general panic, these were impractical and ineffective against the fire. Finally, King Charles II ordered houses to be pulled down, which at the time was a bold decision. At this point, the fire had been burning for over 10 hours and had destroyed nearly 1,000 homes. The King appointed his brother, the Duke of York, to take charge of the firefighting efforts. By Monday, the efforts to control the Great Fire were becoming more organised, with the Duke of York setting up command posts with firefighters all around the perimeter. However, once the fire had crossed both Cheapside and the Fleet River, it was inevitable that St Paul's would be the next to succumb. Much as it is today, St Paul's was a revered landmark. With the fire still out of control, by Tuesday, flames began to appear on the roof at around 8 p.m. Rumours soon began to spread that the fire was not an accident and was an act of foreign terrorism. It was thought to be revenge for an attack 2 weeks earlier by Sir Robert Holmes in the Dutch town of West Smithfield, where he had set fire to a fleet of 140 ships. Frenchman Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire, and despite his confession not corresponding properly with the events, he was tried, found guilty and hanged. After his death, it was actually discovered that Hubert arrived in London 2 days into the fire. Thomas Farriner and his family, in whose bakery the fire is thought to have started, signed the True Bill, which condemned Hubert to death. Other rumours were that the fire was a papist plot or a punishment sent by God for the behaviour of sinful Londoners. High up on Cock Lane in Smithfield Market is a small gold statue known as the Golden Boy of Pye Corner. This statue represents the sin of gluttony, and the plaque located underneath it explains this. Many people thought the fire was brought about by the sin of gluttony, as the fire started at Pudding Lane and ended at Pye Corner. The Great Fire lasted 5 days and resulted in up to 100,000 people losing their homes, and 87 churches were either destroyed or badly damaged. Remarkably, very few deaths are recorded. The rebuilding of London lasted over 40 years. Later, a monument to the Great Fire of London was built, designed by Sir Christopher Wren. It stands 61 metres high. This represents the distance from the monument to Pudding Lane, where the Great Fire of London started. After the Great Fire of London, a new chapter in London's history began, and London became the centre of innovation. During this period, London became the largest city in the world. The free market allowed for huge economic growth and prosperity for some, and the number of merchants and entrepreneurs increased, as did the trade of money, stocks and shares. It should also be remembered that wealth was also generated through slavery. New forms of entertainment were to be found, such as pleasure gardens. In the 18th and 19th centuries, pleasure gardens began to open all over London as disposable incomes increased. They were places where people could come to stroll, drink tea and listen to concerts at the newly built bandstands. But despite rapid house building, London struggled with its population growth and the uneven distribution of wealth. And as poverty increased, huge numbers turned to prostitution and London suffered a gin epidemic. Towards the middle of the 1800s, construction increased as roads were widened and old buildings were replaced, and technological advancements such as gas lighting, iron water pipes, and even a tunnel that was constructed under the Thames to aid crossing were introduced. One of the most interesting and innovative exhibitions is that of the Victorian Walk. This really does bring Victorian London to life. The shop fronts, fixtures and fittings of the Victorian Walk are all original and come from buildings demolished in the 60s and 70s. The shops include a pub, a tobacconist's, a barber's, a chemist, a grocer's, a tailor's and a pawnbroker's. Pawnbrokers, referred to as uncle, were the poor person's bank. Clothing and jewellery were handed over in exchange for a loan. If the loan was not repaid within a year, uncle could sell the goods. By 1900, there were 700 pawnbrokers in London. Forfeited articles for sale in this window include Sunday best clothing, wedding gifts and ornaments. The barber's shop has original fittings from several shops, including Pottles in Upper Street, Islington. The copper towel heater dispensed steaming towels to soothe the skin after a close shave. The shop fittings from the tobacconist are from Redford's in Clerkenwell. The wooden Highlander and Blackamoor figures advertise the sale of Scottish snuff and American tobacco. There is also a bank office and a recreation of a showroom of the glass manufacturers James Powell and Sons, who produced their famous White Friars glass from a working glass house in the City of London until the 1920s. Overcrowding and poor sanitation led to debates on London streets. Between 1821 and 1871, London's population doubled from 1.6 to 3.2 million, and it reached 8.6 million by 1939. The population increase meant that new citywide authorities were established to tackle social and welfare problems, but diseases such as cholera still killed many people. With industrialisation, new communications, the introduction of railways and continued increasing growth, London was becoming the heart of the most powerful nation in the world. And the Great Exhibition of 1851 highlighted this. Sometimes referred to as the Crystal Palace Exhibition, it was an internal exhibition that took place in London from the 1st of May to the 11th of October 1851. Housed within a building that was constructed entirely of cast iron and plate glass, it was the first in a series of world fairs with exhibitions of culture and industry that became popular in the 19th century. After the exhibition, the building was relocated in South London on Penge Common, where it remained until it was destroyed by fire in 1936. By the late Victorian period, suburbs around London were built and became home to new working and middle classes, whereas the very poorest and the richest remained in the centre of London. As we tour this part of the museum, we have images which are taken from the Suffragettes Fellowship collection. The suffragette movement was one of the most important lobbying organisations in history. Their fight for the right for women to vote highlighted the divide between the sexes that had existed for generations. The suffragette campaign had a huge impact on Edwardian society. The suffragettes were members of the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, which was founded in 1903 by the Pankhurst family. Women had been campaigning peacefully since 1860, principally led by Mrs. Fawcett. The WSPU, led by the Pankhursts, adopted more militant methods with the slogan, "Deeds, not words." Women were finally granted the vote in 1918. Also on display, there is one of London's iconic symbols, the red telephone box. These were designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott in 1923. His influence for the design came from the renowned architect Sir John Soane 100 years earlier. He was most noted for designing the Bank of England and the dining room at 10 Downing Street. At St Pancras Old Church in King's Cross stands the Soane family tomb, designed by Sir John Soane himself and actually resembles a London telephone box. The colour red was to make them easy to spot, and by 1926 onwards the fascia of the kiosk was emblazoned with a prominent crown representing the British government. The red phone boxes are often seen as a British cultural icon and are still present in London today. London was heavily affected during the First World War, with food shortages and aerial bombs. But it was during the period between the First and Second World Wars that London slowly became the more modern city that we know today. Within the People's City, we have the first motorised taxi, and I'm going to meet and talk to Alex Werner about the evolution of the London cab. As a London taxi driver, obviously I'm greatly interested in the exhibit behind us here.
Well, this is one of our most popular exhibits with our audience. It's a very, very early motorised taxi that dates from 1908. It was made by a French company called a Unique Taxi. What's interesting from my point of view is that the coachwork, the interior, seats and all that was made in London.
My taxi, now I can take 5 passengers. How many people would that have been able to accommodate?
I think this taxi, it was 4 to 5 as well. But you have to remember the old Hansom cabs, really it was 2 people. So I think these Uniques, as they began to come in, they began to accommodate more passengers.
Yeah.
So this is the period when petrol is beginning to come in London. But this was still an early period, so I think there was probably some reliability problems in the beginning of the 20th century. The cab driver probably had to take it into the garage quite frequently to be serviced, because these would have been on the roads a lot.
Right, sounds a little bit like today.
The other thing that I'm quite interested in is obviously the Hansom cab is well known, but there was another cab that was on the streets. They were known as growlers, and they were sort of slightly bigger than the Hansom cab. But I think the Hansom cab will be the one that we always remember because of Sherlock Holmes and that sort of late Victorian period.
Yes,
it was
absolutely.
so popular, and it was by far the quickest way of getting around the city.
Absolutely, yeah. The only thing I do notice about here as well is how exposed the driver would have been. I wouldn't have liked to have driven this in the sort of winter months.
But if you think of the Hansom cab driver, he was perched up atop,
yes,
and he had blankets and everything around him. You can imagine, again, in the driving rain, it must have been pretty hideous for him.
Do you know how long this taxi lasted when it was replaced?
I think this went through in the 1920s and 1930s and then was restored after the Second World War. And I've got a feeling that you know, if you look very carefully, and you might see it in a couple of very famous films. Obviously, at the times of great emergencies for the city, taxis were requisitioned by the military to take troops around, and also during the Second World War, during the Blitz as well. I think there were lots of taxis were used to ferry, because there weren't enough ambulances, to ferry the wounded from some of the bomb sites to the hospitals. So yeah, they were called on quite a lot. So it's not just for hire in the streets of London. They've been very, very useful for London. You can imagine in the Second World War, during the bombing, there'd be lots of streets that would be blocked out because of the bombing. There were, the houses would have fallen into the road. So good knowledge of all the back alleys, ways to get round to sort of circumnavigate the city as quickly as possible, because there might have been someone who really needed emergency treatment in the hospital. So it's absolutely crucial. Yeah, so, you know, it relied a lot on the skill and knowledge of taxi drivers.
Well, I will say, I mean, it's a beautiful looking vehicle, but I think I'll stick with my modern taxi. It looks a bit warmer. There are several other unique objects within the People's City Gallery. One of which is this gilded bronze lift, which was one of several installed in Selfridges department store in 1928. Selfridges opened on Oxford Street in 1909, and by the 20s it was the most glamorous department store in London. The interior metal panels depicted cranes and were designed by Edgar William Brandt. The metalwork of the exterior screens represents the signs of the zodiac. Selfridges initially employed young women to operate the store lifts, but after World War II they were replaced by disabled ex-servicemen. This lift was removed during a refurbishment of the store in the 70s and is now housed at the Museum of London. There is also this fantastic Savoy Grill sign, which was first made for the Savoy Grill and restaurant to attract American tourists in the 1920s and 30s. Another great artefact of historical importance is this metal-framed and curved glass window, which formed part of the shop front of J. Lyons Corner House and Restaurant in Coventry Street. The corner house opened in 1909, but this window dates from 1922 when the restaurant underwent a refurbishment. Located near Piccadilly Circus, in the heart of London's West End, Coventry Street was the first of 3 corner houses to be opened by the catering firm in central London. Along with Lyons tea rooms, corner houses became one of London's best-loved dining institutions, popular with everyone from businessmen to shopgirls. The Chinese-style panel on display was part of a lift interior in Marshall and Snellgrove's department store on Oxford Street and dates back to the 1930s. The origins of the firm can be traced back to 1837, when a Yorkshire man, Mr. James Marshall, opened a shop at 11 Vere Street. The Oxford Street premises were taken over by Debenhams in 1919, and the shop remained trading under the name Marshall and Snellgrove until 1974. When the premises was completely rebuilt and the name changed to Debenhams. After the war, London was still suffering from the ravaging effects. The museum charts the emergence of a truly cultural city. Whilst the Blitz of London in the Second World War left the city badly damaged and over 100,000 people homeless, the rise of the welfare state saw efforts to improve housing and reduce inequalities in healthcare and education. In 1951, the Festival of Britain on London's South Bank also attempted to lift the spirits of Londoners. The city became more multicultural with a surge in immigration from various parts of the world, and the landscape was forever altered by high-rise flats, a trend that is now being reversed. Booming London was at the heart of the swinging 60s, but was soon to feel the effects of the economic decline in the 1970s, which resulted in the demolition of some very important historical buildings. One such building, although now demolished, was the Firestone factory. But the large gates can still be seen here at the museum. The building was designed by Wallace Gilbert and Partners, and they were famous for their eye-catching designs. Unfortunately, in February 1980, the Firestone tyre factory closed its gates and 1,500 people lost their jobs. During the August bank holiday weekend of that year, the Department of Environment decided to spot list the factory to save it from demolition. But as it was a bank holiday, nobody could be found to sign the papers. Unfortunately, on Saturday the 23rd of August, that building was demolished. The City of London was transformed again in the 1980s, but just as before, the wealth generated was unevenly distributed, and the period saw social and racial unrest. The museum has a fantastic model on display called the Ghetto, and it symbolises a great change in the city during the 90s. It is a model of 2 streets in Hackney, London. It was lived in by squatters, artists and families. Hackney Council wanted to demolish these houses. And by the museum acquiring this model, the publicity it provoked saved the houses from demolition. A community organisation now runs these houses locally. London hosted a hugely successful Olympics in 2012, and its legacy lives on. The cauldron was the centrepiece of the London 2012 Olympic Games. The Games reinforced London as a cultural and global force.
We're very lucky here at the Museum of London to have the original cauldron from the 2012 London Olympic Games. When Thomas Heatherwick got the commission for the cauldron, it was really Danny Boyle who was very keen to, I think, to secure him. Heatherwick's one of the most creative living designers, I think, in the world, and his team came up with this fantastic design of a sort of like a petal-like, plant-like form. They had to keep very hush-hush because they didn't want the secret to get out. One of the interesting things is that when he was given the commission, one of the things they said had no moving parts because on a previous Olympic Games the mechanism had failed. They came up with this design which did need moving parts. So there was quite a lot of risk element in terms of the design. The 2012 cauldron was built up near Harrogate. It was assembled over a long period of time, and each individual petal is unique. It has a different form. And here in the museum we have on display some of the original wooden moulds that actually made the petals. Now, one of the unique elements of the cauldron is the way that it functions, the way that it lights up and then moves. And if you were at the Olympic opening ceremony, or watching it on television, you heard a sort of gasp of awe as the cauldron began to lift up, and it was just an amazing experience. And I think there was so much riding on this opening ceremony, and the cauldron really just was an incredible tour de force that really established the London Games.
As the museum shows, the City of London is the capital's historical core, steeped in tradition and history, and yet modern at the same time. You can walk through the streets and feel as if you're in medieval London, and yet you turn a corner and you join the hustle and bustle of the 21st century. And as London continues to evolve, the Museum of London will be charting its development.